Pro-Life Waco presents From Darkness into the Light, a testimony by Julie Wilkinson, introduction given by Abby Johnson, recorded on February 12, 2023 at the Second Sunday Luncheon.
So we got it started and we thought we'd have 12 workers come through our ministry in the first year. And in the first year, we had over 50. And what we didn't expect, what we should have expected, what we didn't expect was we started having people reach out to us who had left the abortion industry many years ago, but had carried this guilt in their heart for decades. And they had never spoken to anybody about it. Some of their family didn't know. Important people in their lives, they didn't know. They felt they carried this shame and they didn't know who to talk to about it. And they didn't feel like they could talk to anybody because nobody really understood what they had done. And they felt ashamed. And these women started reaching out to us and saying, "Can you help me? I feel alone." And so we said, "Well, yeah, of course, we can help you too." And Julie was one of those people who reached out to us. And very early on, actually, as we were starting and then there were none, she was kind of one of our guinea pigs because we didn't really know what we were doing at the time. And Julie came to our first retreat that we had at Eagle's Wings. It's like the campiest of the camp, like where kids go for summer camp. And Julie came there and slept on a bunk bed, and and it was great. And we had a great time. And Julie worked for Dr. Warren Hern. He is pretty notorious. He's a notorious abortionist. He is the only provider in the United States currently that will abort a baby through all 40 weeks of pregnancy. He has a facility in Boulder, Colorado, called Boulder Abortion Clinic. He doesn't try to hide what he is or what he does. He's very proud of himself. One thing that's kind of striking about his abortion facility is that it's just right in the middle of town. It's just right in the middle of this medical community. And he has an incinerator in his facility so that he doesn't have to contract out taking these whole babies, right, and getting rid of them. So he actually incinerates them in his own facility. And I went there one time after dropping Grace off at a camp in Colorado, and I pulled up by his facility, and it's just so bizarre to think that right here in the middle of this town, women are walking in, some of them right up next to their due date, fully pregnant, walking into this facility, delivering full-term babies. He kills them, puts them into an incinerator, burns their bodies, and people are just going about their day, just walking on these sidewalks while this horror is taking place right in the middle of town. Julie worked at Dr. Hern's clinic in the 80s, and I'll let her tell her story about how she came to know the Lord and left the facility. It's really beautiful. But I think it's a beautiful testimony. Now we're up to 600 and almost 40 abortion facility workers who have come through, former abortion facility workers who have come through, and then there were none. And I think that's just such a testament to the fact that those people who told me some people were too far gone, that's such a lie. God can redeem anyone. God's in the business of conversion. And I saw a I saw a graphic one time. You sent it to me, right, Karen? I think it was, and it kind of took my breath away when I saw it. It was a picture, and it had St. Paul going into heaven. And it said something like, "Isn't it amazing that Paul entered the gates of heaven being cheered on by those that he killed?" And I thought, wow, that's so profound, right? But that's just how good God is. And I thought, man, I hope, I have faith that God will grant me that one day. I have hope that God will grant me and Julie and all of those in our ministry that gift one day, that when we enter heaven, those babies that we help to facilitate their deaths, they will be there cheering on the fact that we made it. And so with that, I would like to welcome Julie Wilkinson.
Hello to everybody. I am so thrilled at what an incredible, incredible group John and all of his helpers have created here. It's just awesome. You know, I've been trying since Abby's group helped give me the freedom to be brave enough to talk. I've spoken in Oklahoma a number of times, but this is by far the most vigorous group that I've ever encountered. And I sure hope someone finds it in them to step up to the plate and carry on his incredible work. Bill and I got to town yesterday, as you heard about, we drove down. American Airlines randomly told me late at night, the night before, your flight's delayed 4.5 hours. I thought, great. That pretty much cuts out connections in DFW. And I told my husband, and he said, let's drive down. And my wonderful husband, who can drive hours and hours and never be bothered, he drove me down. But it was great because we had time to, John gave us the grand tour. I'd never been to Waco before, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. It's a pretty town and so many neat buildings, and then of course this, which is so wonderful and it's so incredible. So, you heard a little bit about my story from Abby, and I have told the story a number of times, as I said. One part that I decided to change up a little bit this time is a lot of people, many times, when I've told people what I used to do, I can see a flicker in their eyes. Why wouldn't you? You seem like such a nice person. I know what they're thinking. You rescue kittens. You know, you're always taking care of something or somebody. I love babies. How could you do that? And that's a question I'll never thoroughly be able to answer for myself either. But some things, as I think about it, because I think it's educational for others, you know, we're learning now how much impact media has on children, right? Everyone's more and more aware of these huge amount of negatives that so many kids, things children are hearing. And it wasn't as available when I was a child. I was born in 1958, grew up through the 60s and 70s, but negative things were still there. And my family was what I'd call a stable family. A lot of the former workers come from broken families. My dad was a physician, my mom had been a nurse, and there were 4 of us. I was the eldest. But my dad, and he was a great doctor, by the way. Everybody liked him. He was an eye physician. He was also addicted to pornography. And I won't go into that because we have a mixed audience here. But it was not kept hidden. Okay, it was around. Not like in the living room, but certainly accessible. And kids being kids and curious, you look at stuff. And it's not so much that you're learning about anatomy and physiology prior to when you probably should, but that you are losing respect for the sacred image of your own body and other people's bodies. As I look back and I think about how that made it easier for me to see somebody's body is not something created by God that was beautiful and should be respected. And so that was, mind you, I always take responsibility of the fact that I did a terrible thing working at Warren Hern's. But that is contributed to me being more willing to accept that kind of position. Another thing that was strange in our house was that he had a room that was called his office, and that's where a lot of the porn lived. But he also had a large, oversized test tube, and that wasn't kept hidden from us. And floating inside formaldehyde was a probably 9-10 week pregnancy, maybe a little earlier. And of course, we're curious, what is this? And Mom said, well, I think he got that when he was in training and was assisting on a tubal pregnancy, something of that nature. But nonetheless, and of course, as a kid, you're fascinated. But I look back at that and I think, we had dehumanized that person. Instead of that tubal, because everyone I'm sure here knows tubal pregnancies are not survivable for the baby. And they can be fatal for the mother. So that's one instance where that's really the only instance where terminating a pregnancy is legitimate. And it's very early on when the baby starts to form in the tube and doesn't advance to the uterus, so it's not going to live. Well, anyway, for whatever reason, he saved it. So that's kind of weird too. I mean, it would have been one thing if he would have said, isn't this sad, isn't this heartbreaking, this treasure, this was somebody's child, but nothing like that was ever said. So again, it was another step towards thinking, well, babies that size aren't really people yet. So anyway, so that was, and then the third thing that I thought about recently, because you never stop thinking about these things, is that he was a very intelligent man. He had lots of books of all kinds, and I read a lot of them just because I was a reader. Well, maybe some people will remember Paul Ehrlich wrote The Population Bomb. That was like 68 or 69, something like that. And he was, now there's tons of people like that believe people are a scourge on the earth, but he was one of the early ones. And he wrote a book on how the whole place was, everybody, devastation, famine, it was all bad. There were so many people, too many people, and it was all going to be terrible. And my dad, I read the book, and I thought, well, that's interesting. We'll see if it happens. But he actually said to me one day, if I would have had this book sooner, we would never have had your two younger brothers. And I remember even then, because I couldn't have been more than early teens maybe, thinking, wow, you wouldn't have had Ben and Tim. I mean, that's just incredible that anyone would even verbalize that. And he was not an abusive father, okay? There was not, I wouldn't say he was particularly warm, but he was not somebody that actively mistreated them, but he was planting seeds of ideas. And that's what I think helps contribute to somebody making a terrible decision that I made later. So anyway, back in 1984, I'd been a nurse for 3 years, about 3 years, and I had worked in intensive care, and I wanted some adventure, so I went down to Florida and took a job. They would hire winter nurses on Miami Beach, because of course people go there to vacation, they need more nurses, and that was a lot of fun. But one thing about intensive care nursing is that you learned how to, just like EMTs, paramedics, you learn how to kind of build a wall around your emotions because you have to go forward functioning when terrible emergencies happen, traumas, etc. And that is a useful skill for those situations. But that also contributed to me being able to not relate emotionally as I should to abortions. So all these factors kind of come in together. And I had broken up with a guy, and I thought, I got to have a change. So one of my nursing school buddies lived in Boulder, Colorado. And I thought, well, that'll be an adventure. So I went out there, found me a little trailer to rent. And at that time, there were no jobs in Boulder Community Hospital, which, by the way, as Abby's mentioning, it's in the center of town. His abortion clinic is directly across the street from the hospital. So pregnant women go in there to have babies, or they could cross the street and destroy them. So anyway, there wasn't a job in town, and I was afraid pants about driving down to Denver with all the traffic, and I looked in the classifieds, and here was an ad for a family planning clinic. That's exactly how it was described. And I thought, okay, a clinic, birth control pills. And I get in there, and he was always very wary of everyone. And he takes me in the office to ask me questions. And then I figured out pretty quick, this is actually an abortion clinic. Well, I didn't really have a big problem with that for reasons I've given you. Plus, my parents were pro-choice, that friendly little term. And I told Dr. Hern, my parents donate to NARAL, and oh boy, he thought that was cool. And I said, I don't have a personal problem with it. I actually did, because to myself I thought, well, I'll never have one, but if other women need to, the baby's better off than to go into an abusive family. I mean, you justify all kinds of things when you're trying to do something that's inappropriate. So, anyway, so he hired me, and even though I was raised a Christian, I grew up in the Presbyterian Church, which isn't particularly known, unfortunately, for being pro-life. And so I never had even heard of sanctity of life. That wasn't even an issue for me. I did remember, my mind flashed back to a friend in high school who was a Catholic, who had gotten pregnant in high school, unmarried, and I remember saying to her, well, have you thought about having an abortion? And she whipped her head around and looked at me and she said, that would be murder. And I'm so proud of her that she said that, I felt a little embarrassed, unfortunately not embarrassed enough to not work for them at some point, but she had her child. She was 16 years old, bravo to her. But, so anyway, so I told you about the interview, and I told him, he was very suspicious, and he even showed me this little bullet hole in the window. It looked like maybe a .22 had hit it. I don't know when that happened. He was very proud of that bullet hole, and he never fixed it, and he always showed it to everybody because we were supposed to feel sorry for him, that he was in such danger. I never, in the 2.5 years I worked there, I never saw physical threats of any kind to the clinic, but anyway. So I was hired, and there was another RN that worked for him, and she taught me how to do the GYN exams. Part of our job was the initial visit to see how far along somebody was. And we never said things like 10 weeks, 12 weeks from the physical exam, the internal exam, but it was described as the size of a fruit, because that's a great way to dehumanize a baby, right? It would either be a tangerine, or an orange, or a grapefruit. Now back then, the limit in Colorado was 24 weeks. And he actually very strictly adhered to that because I think he was terrified of having his clinic shut down. So if it was a grapefruit, he had a pretty primitive ultrasound at that time, and he would do a quick scan measuring the size of the skull to see whether or not it was still within the range where he could legally do the procedure. People came from out of state to Warren Hern's, as I'm sure they do now, and now they come from other countries. Because even in Europe, you can't go, is it 15 weeks or 18 weeks? Yeah, even in Europe, super liberal Europe, and we're the Christians here in America. Isn't that amazing? They don't allow abortions after 15 weeks. Incredible. And these women pay tens of thousands of dollars. I don't know what he charges now for a late case. They were about $18,000 when I was there. Yeah. So anyway, so that was our exam day. And so then we'd have a lineup of who was going to come in. And they used a dilation. We don't need to go into that, but it's basically a dehydrated seaweed that you put in the cervix, and it gradually dilates, blah, blah. And then the person comes in the next day, if they're a late case, to get another round of that. And then we have abortion day. We actually had 2 days a week that were abortion day. And so I was his assistant then. And so I would open the sterile, because you have to use, he actually, oddly, as disreputable person as he is, he was technically proper. He kept things sterile. He didn't, Abby's told me stories of things she's seen, of blood on the wall or dirty instruments other people have talked about. That was not happening there. Things were sterile. Things were done properly. So I would be his assistant, and I would open everything, and he did not want to give people any kind of pain control because he didn't want to deal with recovery from pain control. So I had to do, they would have their counselor with them on one side and me on the other and try to counsel them, calm them down, because of course it's very uncomfortable, but he wouldn't give them anything for pain. If he had a late case, the patients would come in, and it was a 3-day procedure for them, and on the final day, and this was somebody up until 24 weeks, so it was like about 18 to 24 weeks that he'd do these, and they had to come early in the morning, and he would do an amniotomy. He would take out fluid, withdraw fluid that the baby floats in. And I had already mixed up this glass, it looked like a small IV bottle, that had urea, which is a salt solution. And I had to mix that up with sterile water or saline. And he would inject that in to replace the fluid he'd taken out. And so I even asked him once, I said, well, why, how does this, because I'd heard other things about how people ended the lives of the unborn, and he said, well, this causes the placenta to break down and then they can't live. Well, what didn't occur to me, probably because I didn't want to believe it, was how much that had to hurt. Babies do feel. They feel pain. Sometimes people, even when I worked years later, level 3 nursery, they'd be like, oh, they don't have that much sensation. Well, baloney to that. They cried when they got their heel stuck for a blood test. So I know that they hurt when that urea was burning. So the whole rest of that Saturday, I would go in periodically and listen for fetal heart tones, because he really didn't want one coming out alive. And so I would listen, and if I didn't hear heart tones anymore, then he would do the rest of the evacuation. And it would be many pieces. Let's just say that. So we would have, and oftentimes these were girls that were young who'd somehow kept the secret from their mom and had come from another state. And so that's what would happen then. And you could certainly see the discoloration of the tissue as to how much damage there had been from that hypertonic solution and how terribly painful that had to be. So, and sometimes, as I said, sometimes they had to be taken apart to get them out. He had a girl who was in medical school, a young woman, and she worked as his lab person, and she would check to see that everything had been taken out. And that means counting limbs and, that kind of thing. At that time, he didn't have the incinerator, so he must have used Stericycle or something like that to haul everything off. I never actually saw protesters, because the way that building is set up, it's like half above ground on the main street, and then it's below ground. And so we drove around to the back and had a special key to get in, because he, God forbid any of us should start to feel guilty and not come back to work. So I literally don't even remember seeing someone. In fact, I remember one time there was this little rumor circulating around that people were writing down our license numbers off of our cars, and we better be careful or something. Well, that never happened to me. So anyway, after about 2.5 years of that, and mind you, I always considered myself a Christian. I still thought that this was something some people needed. I didn't have a gigantic change of heart all of a sudden. I wish I did. But I just felt like I didn't want to be there anymore. And I quit that job and took a position in Denver, University of Colorado, and it was a job called the perinatal float pool, which meant and any day I came to work, I'd either be in level 1, 2, or 3 nursery. 3 is the really tinies, or I'd be taking care of moms who were in premature labor. And I absolutely loved working there. I loved seeing these itty bitty little people. And it was, you can imagine the quandary in my head that not only had I taken a check for helping end those, and I mean, it was trying to resolve all this, if you've been raised to think that this is an uncomfortable thing, but it was the right thing. I mean, I don't know. It's just thoughts swirling in your head. But I worked there, and I think God must have put me there intentionally, because I needed to have the healing of seeing live children, living children. And that was great, because back then, the earliest they'd save somebody was 26 weeks. Now we know they save 22, maybe even 21 for some of them, And those are babies that even at that age that Warren was doing away with. One story, I'm sorry I'm skipping a little bit because I forgot. I should follow my notes like I'm supposed to. But a significant story that happened while I was still in his clinic, like I said, typically, most of the time, it was young women who found themselves in a situation, didn't know what else to do. But one time, there was whispering among the staff, and this was a couple, what we called yuppies then, were young couple, well-to-do, doing okay. You could tell by the way they were dressed. There weren't any financial stresses. They wanted to get pregnant. But then they found out it was twins, and they weren't sure if they should have twins or not. So they were doing their research. I kid you not. They visited people they knew who had twins, hung around, see what's life like with twins. Then they came to Warren's to see what it would be like to end a twin pregnancy. And weirdly, all of us kind of hoped we wouldn't see them again. That was a line it was like too much even for us. Because this couple was financially able and wanted a child, but because it was twins. So we thought, hopefully we'll never see them again. Unfortunately, they came back and eliminated 17-week twins, who she had been feeling moving for a while. And that will never leave my mind. I've often wondered if she ever went on to have any children. But, wow. So anyway, like I said, when I worked at University of Colorado, that was a great healing thing. And then the best thing I ever did in my life was join the Wyoming Air National Guard, because that's where I met my husband, Bill. And I served as a flight nurse. He was a med tech, and we got married, and we moved up there. And then I ended up working in labor and delivery in that hospital, which was a job I absolutely loved. So if this sounds psychotic, I guess it's because it is. But I really did love that. And we went on to have 3 daughters who we adore and are blessed to have 4 grandchildren now. It's a blessing I certainly don't deserve after everything I did. I still was feeling pretty lonely. We'd moved to Oklahoma finally, and the internet was just getting going, at least for me. I think we were on America Online. And there were bulletin boards. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram. There were no other, it was hard to, I don't know. People didn't even know about reaching out to people at that point. But for the life of me, I wish I knew which page that was, because it was something to do. I would check periodically. I'd look for former workers, or I thought, gosh, I wish there was somebody. Because maybe 5 people knew where I'd ever worked. We didn't tell the girls till they were late teens, because I was so ashamed of it. And there was something to do with pro-life. And you could still be anonymous then. You couldn't do that now. But I wrote a question on the bulletin board and said, I wish there was some place for people who had worked in the abortion industry. And I know it was a man who responded. I wish I knew who it was. And he said, you need to talk to Abby Johnson. And somehow he knew you. And so the connection was made, and I got a phone call, and it was the first time I'd really shared my story with anybody except for my husband. And she had the retreat down here in Texas. And one of the cool things to me is that I listen to Christian talk, and there used to be little pro-life spots that Father Frank Pavone would do. And I loved them. They were very meaningful, and the music form and everything was just meaningful. And who is there greeting us at the first retreat but Father Frank? I mean, rock star to me. It was just unbelievable. I couldn't believe I was seeing this person that I heard talk about pro-life. And I also, of the 5 of us there, one was Sue Thayer, who I believe you guys have had talk here, who passed away a little over a year ago. And I miss her so much because Sue and I formed such a close friendship. We were close in age, and she'd worked in a clinic in Iowa. And anyway, so that was a real amazing thing, to finally find other people who wouldn't look at you in a weird way or have that flicker in their eye when they heard what you used to do to make money. And still, as I say, years went by before I had the courage not only to tell my own kids, but to finally reach out in the community to pro-life groups and say, hey, I'm available. I'll talk for nothing. If you want to hear, I'll talk. So I've gone to small pregnancy centers, in Oklahoma, and told my story to them. And I'm just going to continue to do that, as it can help somebody else, because people just need to know that. I don't have 3 eyes, and I don't look like some weird recognizable monster, but I was still a person that was capable of doing things that were really wrong. And one thing I want to add here Oh, and I did have a little part in Unplanned. Abby asked me, it was filmed in Oklahoma and in Stillwater, actually. And so I went up and if you've seen Unplanned, I'm in the scene with Dr. Levatino. I play the nurse. I was doing my actual old job, turning on the suction and all that kind of thing. So that's my little thing there. But I give away copies of it everywhere I go. If anybody wants one, I brought some. Also, let's see. I wanted to tell you real quick that another thing Warren Hern used to do. This is not a very professional speech because I'm jumping around, but I just found a new article on him, and because he's still doing abortions at age 86. And yeah, he has just written a book, and it's called Homo Ecophagus, a deep diagnosis to save the earth. And someone interviewed him. And if you do a search for Warren Hern's new book, I haven't even listened to the radio interview yet either. But he believed even when I worked there, that humans were really a cancer on the earth. And there were just too many of us. And he would go down to Peru every summer. We'd close the clinic for a couple weeks, and he'd go down there supposedly doing medical care. Well, my philosophy is I believe he was probably going down there to sterilize women. I'll bet you money he was. He probably told them that he was whatever. Who knows what he told them? But that's just my theory. I don't know what he was doing, but I doubt it was out of the goodness of his heart. And so anyway, this book he wrote, he says, human species is, the name means man who devours the ecosystem. He said, we are a superorganism on the planet that has all the major characteristics of a malignant process. So did you guys know that you're a cancer? So anyway, yeah, so this is the kind of person who's saying these things and has quite a following in Colorado. Colorado, as you know, they're fine with having really even later than, I don't know, how many weeks is it in Colorado now? Is it fall? Yeah. So, somebody asked me if I would be willing to give some testimony at a court hearing. This is several months ago. I can't remember which of you guys did, but I was on the phone on whatever the conference call or whatever it's called for like 8 hours, and they let every pro-abortion person go first. It was like 8 or 9 in the evening, and you could tell looking into the courthouse in Colorado that everybody had cleared out. So I just thought, well, I might as well hang up because clearly they're not going to want to listen to my side of the story. So that's a heartbreak for me. I love Colorado. It's such a beautiful state. And it's a harbor of such terrible things. But the terrible things are in more places than that, and we know that. In Oklahoma, we're proud because right now we're abortion-free. We're very thankful for that. We have a pro-life governor, and thank goodness. So anyway, if anyone has questions that I could answer for you, happy to do it.
Well, Abby had said something about your conversion to Christianity or just your connection to God. I just wanted to hear a little bit about that.
Well, as I said, I think I always felt I was. I was raised in Sunday school, but nobody ever talked about sanctity of life. And that's another thing I should have said sooner. We need to talk about this stuff with kids. We did with our girls. We talked about life is precious because we homeschooled. And if they heard about so-and-so, I've heard so-and-so is messing around and she might be pregnant. I said, whoa, stop right now. If that happened, it's unfortunate. She made a mistake. But if she's pregnant, she needs all the support she can get because this is a precious life that God put there. And we have no right to encourage somebody to end that. So we have to be brave enough to intervene in what kids are learning and hearing because the other side is bombarding them with all the other information about how you shouldn't interfere with your life. It'll stop you going to college. It'll stop your career, whatever. And I know you guys already know this, but don't be afraid to talk to young people.
Talk about listening to James Dobson.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Dobson also, as well as Father Frank's Life Spots, was somehow my radio dial would get over to FM when I'd be leaving there, and I would kind of get mad at him because he sounded so holier than thou, but I couldn't stop listening to him. And, I thought, how do you know what's going on? And there was a time where he was talking about when you ask forgiveness, your sins are as far as the east is from the west. And I literally could have this mental vision of like this giant white sheet. And over there was where I was, and over here is where I could be. And that has given me comfort so many times that you can have that lifted from you, as awful as it is. And it's so easy to say, well, what about Hitler? Well, what about me? He was terrible too. And if he would have asked forgiveness, he could have been forgiven. You know, we have to be willing to ask forgiveness and humble ourselves. And that's what we also need to teach children.
How did the young ladies without family support afford the abortion?
That's a really good question. I don't know. Because they made it somehow, because money was important to him also. I'm sure they took out credit card loans or whatever it took. And sometimes it was their own family that didn't, you know. I remember one young girl, I don't know, 13 or 14, and I remember them saying, whispering, the counselors, the girls would talk to the counselors, you know, I wouldn't really visit with them much before the procedure. Well, she saw her taking a shower, and she saw that, you know, glimpsed her, and that's when she first knew. And they'd come over from Utah, and I even think they were Mormons, which that's against their faith also. But it was more shaming to the family that she should have this baby. But he was not in this as a charity. He wanted the money too, because he has a very nice house in Black Hawk, Colorado. I never saw it, but that's a very expensive piece of real estate up there, and that's where he lives. So yeah.
I do know that at our clinic and a lot of the clinics, they have like a list of ways you can get money for your abortion. So they had like ask a friend, take out a credit card, go pawn your TV, and they had like a list of things you could pawn in your house. So like the people that answered the phone and made the appointment, like they would give them tips on how you could raise money for your abortion. So I would assume if you're having to pay $15,000 for abortion, I would assume that the people that answer the phone, they probably have tips for that too.
Can you tell us about when you were filming that scene in Unplanned Wake? So it was a real life former abortionist and abortion doctor and a real life former abortion nurse. A lot of the things that I think most of us read were that this was all dramatized, sensationalized in terms of the actual things that happened. So can you kind of talk to that, like some specifics about?
Yeah, it was set up exactly as I remember it, and that's exactly what would happen. If they were wiggling or uncomfortable or unhappy, I would try to calm them down, try to be still, because I knew he wouldn't give them anything for pain. But yes, he would get everything in position, and he didn't say beam me up, Scotty, but he'd turn on the suction, and we had a little cloth cover over the jar. God forbid anybody should actually see what actually goes in there. And my job after that was done was disconnect everything. The counselor would take her to the recovery room, and I would carry the little jar to the room where the pre-med student would examine everything. But that was very accurate, actually. It was weird. Dr. Levatino, I didn't talk that much to him. He's sort of quiet, but it was like instinct. It was standing there, the things I said to her. It's sad that it came back to me that clearly, but I didn't feel like we even had to practice or rehearse. It's just, that's what we did. Very businesslike.
When you left, did you just not come back?
Well, I gave him notice. I'd found that other job in level 3 nursery, and I just kind of said, well, I want to try something different. And I left on friendly terms with him, because even though I wasn't comfortable working in there, I still hadn't reached a point where I felt like this is a bad thing I don't want to be a part of. It was more, and it was kind of interesting because a guy I was dating in that area at that time, I had given his mom a ride to her doctor or something, and she said, so where is it you're working? And I said, well, it's a woman's health clinic. That's what I always said. And she said, oh, it must be so fun to work with those mamas and babies. Dagger to the heart. Yeah. It's like, oh my gosh. So, God was beating me over the head, and I just wasn't listening.
Hern is making a profit on the body parts now instead of incinerating.
That I couldn't answer to. He's got a ton of money because of doing so many of these, and so I don't know, Abby. What do you think?
He hasn't been named as someone who is participating in that, but there's no telling. He could have his own contract with, a cell tech company, and people just don't know about it. He is pretty private I mean, like his business dealings and things like that, he's pretty private.
Yeah, he owns it all.
Yeah, he
So-
owns everything. So it would be hard to find out, I guess is what I'm saying. Like universities that do it, Planned Parenthood, all of that is because they're government entities, essentially, because Planned Parenthood gets money from the government. You can FOIA that, you can do a Freedom of Information request, and you can find that kind of stuff out because they get government money. But he's completely private. He doesn't get any government money. He's completely private. It's just a cash business. So you can't FOIA request for him. So it's difficult to find things out. The largest dilators that they use in clinics. So they're literally like as big as my wrist. So these are dilators they use on late term procedures to deliver, whole intact babies. They're called Hern dilators.
Yeah, I forgot to add that. He had instruments named after himself.
Yeah. And he's very proud.
Yeah. He wrote several books.
He wrote many books,
And
yeah.
he had stacks of them in the break room. And he'd be like, here, take a set. I tossed mine. I wish I'd kept them now to use as, to show people. But he gave, he had, and they're probably on eBay.
Yeah.
But they're also, just to throw this out here before I forget, there's a documentary, and I don't know what year it came out, but it's very interesting to see inside the mind of the late-term doctors. There's nothing graphic in it. It's called After Tiller, because Tiller was the one that was murdered. And so then they made one about like 4 major late docs, and Warren is one of the featured ones. And it's very interesting. I didn't know it had been made till it had been out for a while, and I found it at a used library sale or something. And it really gives you kind of a little bit more insight into the mind of these people in this weird, tiny world they live in. They feel very, very noble about what they're doing.
When they're treated like saints.
Yeah.
I mean, in the abortion world, like at the National Abortion Federation conference, they're treated like gods. They're escorted around everywhere. People, it's like they're rock stars, but particularly the late term abortion providers, like they'll be walking down the hall and you hear people like, oh, that's Dr. Hern. They are the famous people at those conventions. So, when Dr. Tiller was killed, they came out with all these little St. George cards.
Oh my gosh.
And passed them out everywhere. So
this, if you want to find out more about his latest article on the metastasizing humans of the planet, this is the first page of it. I just printed this page, but you can just do a search for Warren Hern's new book, and like I said, the book is called Homo Ecophagus: A Deep Diagnosis to Save the Earth. So, yeah. And there's a link. You can listen to the interview that this guy did with Warren, and I'm going to listen to that when I get home. But good Lord, the guy is 86 years old, and he's still, what 86-year-old surgeon would you go to for anything?